Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation for the Ventura Information and Listening session that we're having today. Before we start, we'd like to introduce ourselves. I'm Courtney Schoenwald with the Planning Department, and with me today are the others you see named here. This part of our work program is a joint venture with the City Planning Department and the Department of Transportation. The agenda you see is what we'll be covering in the meeting today. The purpose of the meeting is to see what you, the community, wants us to consider for allowed expenditures for updating a fee in the that's collected in the specific plan area. We're at the part of our work program where we're getting feedback from you, the public, to help inform how the project impact assessment fees should change. We're discussing the proposed changes that you would like to see and listening to you. This slide may look familiar to you from our open house in February of 2020. As we discussed then, the council motion had three components to it: streamlining signs, updating to the new zoning code without changing any standards, and updating how the project impact assessment fees can be spent. The rezoning portion has moved to the community plan update. As of August 2021, in order to speed the corridor's post-pandemic recovery, we delegated the rezoning portion of the work program to the community plan updates already underway in the Southeast and Southwest Valley. This approach will use the city's resources more effectively and support community by community zoning that respects each neighborhood's priorities and allows for the zoning standards to change as appropriate. The third part, to discuss the project impact assessment fees, is what brought us here today. Before we go into further detail about what this update means, though, we want to provide quick clarification about how the collected fees apply in the corridor today. We need to distinguish the difference between the public right-of-way in contrast to individual lots. The right-of-way includes the sidewalk, street, curbs, and gutters, all the land that is public and a common good. In contrast, individual and mostly privately owned lots that line the corridor is where most of the development occurs. The fees that are collected go towards the right-of-way and cannot apply to these individual lots. The individual lots will be affected by changes in the community plan, which will be updated by the zoning regulations, but are not part of the PIA fee discussion. So here today, we're going to discuss an update to the fees, which will largely cover items in the public right-of-way. And as a reminder, development standards for private lots will be discussed in future outreach events with the community plan team. So what is this project impact assessment fee? They're collected by the Department of Transportation and calculated on land use categories for projects within the corridor in the right-of-way. The fee is calculated by square footage, and there are some caveats for additional fees like a drive-through convenience premium. The motion that directed our work program, though, identified some original expenditures don't meet today's needs. So we've been tasked with looking at ways we can make the fees more flexible to meet today's needs. What's allowed today? Off-street parking, transportation demand management programs, transportation management organizations, and transit. But these items are ill-defined and not really clear enough to let the funds go towards them. There's an option to put the money towards other things with an involved process, but the really big expense has been intersection improvements. There were 19 identified intersections, and 12 and a portion of another have already met the improvement. These are some of the most clearly defined because transportation demand management and transportation management organizations were not well defined, and therefore that's where most of the money went. What's been troubling for the community, though, is that there are these items we've heard are important that are not explicitly allowed. However, keep these in mind as we share more information. However, under no circumstance is maintenance allowed because of the State Fee Mitigation Act, which we'll talk about later. The process for this fee update is detailed here. We're about to show you some research and data we've collected, but we're here today to get your input on what projects you might have in mind. After that, we'll prioritizing and refining before we come up with a draft for adoption. But before we start sharing the data we've gathered, we're going to talk for a moment about some guiding policies. We're going to share some things in the existing specific plan. We're also going to discuss how things have changed policy-wise since the adoption of the plan in 1991. We're going to highlight some of the language in the purposes section of the specific plan. Some of these highlighted purposes, as old as they are, still align with the policy direction of today, which we'll discuss in a minute. Of note, though, some of these purposes, while they were well-intentioned, never fully addressed the specific plan, nor were they adequately funded. The purposes of the plan talk about transportation infrastructure, effective circulation that reduces conflict with motorists, creating attractive pedestrian environments that encourage pedestrian activity and reduce traffic congestion, encouraging pedestrian activity with attractive and active environments, and even alleys because they're part of the transportation system. However, since 1991, many other things have also changed. We're going to start with some citywide ones. A few years ago, we updated our mobility element, which was formerly known as a transportation element. We did this because we updated our approach to transportation. We started to think about mobility for all users. In the 2035 mobility plan here, you can see a snapshot of the mobility circulation system map. The entire Ventura-Cahuenga corridor is designated Boulevard 2 in the mobility plan, and this designation provides standards for the width of the streets and sidewalks. But the shift from auto orientation is also in part because we started thinking about the cost of accidents in vulnerable populations. On average, 36,000 or more Angelenos are killed or injured in motor vehicle collisions per year. That's about 100 per day. And the fatality rate is doubly high for our youngest and oldest residents. However, Vision Zero is an international movement that tries to prevent the loss of life. And in August 2015, Mayor Garcetti launched a local Vision Zero initiative by issuing an executive order that makes human life the top priority in the design of our city streets. The executive directive includes two specific goals: to reduce citywide traffic deaths by 20% and to ultimately eliminate traffic deaths citywide. As a result, there's been an extensive safety study that's been done to better understand collisions on our streets. This safety study informed our Vision Zero action plan. The statistics from Vision Zero note that children, older adults, and people who walk and ride bikes are at greatest risk for collisions that result in severe injury or death. In Los Angeles, people walking and bicycling are involved in only 14% of all collisions, but they account for almost half of all traffic deaths. As a result, Vision Zero Los Angeles is trying to change things to protect those most vulnerable on our streets. We can see the outcomes of these collisions in this map of traffic fatalities. As you can see, the majority of the Ventura-Cahuenga corridor is indicated in red, which notes that it is a segment on the high injury network. Every diamond on this map represents a pedestrian fatality by auto accident. Every gray circle represents a cyclist fatality by auto accident. And every square represents a car passenger or driver who passed away in a traffic crash since 2010. If you notice the color around the shape, that's an accident where people have provided names to these fatalities, reminding us these shapes represent lives lost and aren't just statistics. We're going to take a brief moment here to pause and honor the memory of all those who've lost their lives. If you know someone who is the victim of a traffic fatality, you can email visionsero@lacity.org to help create a digital memorial. Keep in mind, this map does not include crashes where all the persons involved survived with injuries. All right, moving on from this sobering last couple of slides. The state of California also changed their methodology for traffic. They moved from a level of service, or LOS congestion traffic analysis model, to one called vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, which looks at the act of driving. The state required every jurisdiction to move to this methodology by July of 2020, and the city adopted the approach in July of 2019. The methodology focuses on the act of driving rather than congestion as a measure of environmental impacts to help focus on greenhouse gas emissions rather than the inconvenience of time to travel between destinations. What's important to note here is that the project impact assessment fees were based off of the LOS model before, but because we can't just adjust how we spend an existing fund, we have to adopt the new fees based on the new VMT model. So why are we looking at autos in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? It's because today, half of California's greenhouse gas emissions are generated from the transportation sector. California adopted this standard because it can achieve long-term climate goals through a reduction in VMT per capita. Ultimately, lower VMT will reduce regional greenhouse gas emissions. One of the main strategies in this VMT model is to look at travel behavior. And transportation demand management looks at providing tools other than auto travel to manage transportation demands, or in other words, how people want to travel from point A to point B. It's a pretty abstract concept, but we have a local example of a TDM program that you may be familiar with, and I'm going to highlight it here for you. There's a large outdoor music venue in Hollywood that has a robust TDM program. Yes, you can drive there, but for most people, the traffic is terrible and parking is hard or even stacked, which makes driving uncomfortable. The venue is landlocked and hilly and cannot easily add parking to the site. So to deal with this issue, the venue provides park and ride buses as well as shuttles from specific locations to the venue. Visitors can choose how to get there, and many opt not to drive. If the visitor has used a bus or shuttle to get there, that's TDM implementation. The venue has managed to get the visitors there in a mode of transportation that's more efficient for the system and has reduced greenhouse gas emissions. However, TDM can apply to a wide variety of strategies, including bicycling, walking, carpooling, and more. The Transportation Demand Management Program is currently being updated at a citywide level. The specific plan amendment will be aligning with these efforts while making recommendations that address the unique issues and context of the corridor. Some key objectives of the citywide TDM program are to achieve the goals you see on the slide: to reduce VMT and drive-alone trips, promote sustainable mobility options, reduce transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions, as well as to create a straightforward and flexible compliance process for the users. So you have a general context for some of the policies. We're going to share some of the data that we've gathered so far. On this slide, to the right, there's a graphical display of square footage broken down by commercial and residential square footage. Since the adoption of the plan, less than 3.2 million square feet was added, but 20 million was anticipated. And of that 20 million, almost half of that was anticipated to be office, which we aren't seeing as much of. Of note, the specific plan had laid out some development caps or phases. These were set forth with transportation in mind. Addressing congestion led to smaller development that could be constructed. But per state mandate, we no longer measure traffic based on congestion, as we just discussed. The chart also clearly shows the biggest type of development has been residential. It's hard to see, but the communities on the east also had a net loss of some kind of area. Sherman Oaks lost commercial area, Studio City lost residential area, and Cahuenga Pass lost commercial area. In effect, the specific plan limited development, and today we're below the anticipated development level. What's notable about this is that the fees are reliant on development. If development slows or does not happen, we won't have the funding anticipated, and the funding isn't as robust. At a higher level, looking at market trends, though, we notice a few other things. The specific plan area actually has more office space than retail space, but over the last decade, very little office space was added except for medical offices. Some of you may know this, but the medical industry is a very fast-growing industry today. As I said, there's generally more office space than retail on a per square foot basis in the plan area. However, in our pedestrian-oriented areas, the opposite is true, where retail is 70% of the pedestrian-oriented area commercial inventory by square footage, and food and beverage establishments by number are the most common type of business in those areas. Grocery stores have been the most common type of retail product in the plan area, and over the last decade, more retail space has been added, but mainly in grocery stores. 2/3 of this was added to the eastern segment in Sherman Oaks alone. Housing is the most common type of construction in the plan area. 60% of it has been residential. And one more thing to note, commute patterns generally travel east to west or west to east, except for the arterials that connect north and south for freeways or other connections. The exception to this is in Sherman Oaks, where the 405 and Sepulveda intersect. The regional center nature of that area is different. The greater context for some of what we're about to discuss relates to the data we got from our consultants. Keep in mind, the data we're going to share is preliminary, and the information we're sharing is only from a few of the studies we're conducting for the specific plan amendment. We're going to highlight with you that we had our consultants provide data on sidewalks and parking in the corridor because both of these provide access for businesses, residents, and patrons of the boulevard. The sidewalk is perhaps the most important infrastructure that can create an attractive pedestrian environment and distinct economic district. The specific plan mentions parking as an issue, but has not provided the adequate tools or resources to produce or manage parking to keep up with demand. Our consultant has also collected data that will help us gain a better picture of parking conditions. I'll also note for sidewalks and parking that's been provided, The data has required extensive coordination with other departments such as Department of Transportation, Bureau of Engineering, Streets LA, Sanitation, Street Lighting, and more. But now I'm going to hand the presentation over to Delia Arriaga, who's going to share some more specific geographic information. Delia?
Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to move on to present the parking data and the sidewalk data that we've collected so far. We divided the 17-mile corridor into the western and eastern segments because conditions are significantly different along the corridor east and west of the 405 freeway. And this aligns with the community plan boundaries as well. We are only providing preliminary data gathered for sidewalks and on-street parking today. We begin with the western segment, which starts at the Arroyo Calabasas and ends at the 405. Our consultant collected data along the entire corridor and divided the western segment into a total of 8 sub-areas. 3 of these sub-areas, shown here in dark green, were originally designated as pedestrian-oriented areas, or POAs, by the Adopt a Specific Plan to create a more pedestrian-friendly environment in the commercial cores of these communities. In the interest of time, we'll be focusing on the 3 POAs, starting with Woodland Hills and moving east to Tarzana and Encino. Before we start, we'll walk through a few images to ground ourselves along the western segment and the general conditions of the right-of-way. The red stars here indicate the locations of the pictures in the following slides. This image was taken from the center of the right-of-way facing west toward Ponce Avenue, where Ventura is at least 90 feet wide, accommodates 7 lanes of traffic, and provides on-street parking on either side. Here we are once again at the center of the right-of-way, this time facing west toward Peralta Avenue, where the street narrows to a maximum of 80 feet in width and minus 1 lane of traffic. This is Shirley and Ventura. As a general trend, the right-of-way narrows as we move east on Ventura. This picture was taken at Ventura and Nestle, where the Encino Tarzana Library is located, and high visibility crosswalks are present at this intersection. This is Plaza de Oro at Encino Commons, where a mid-block signal crossing with a landscape median complements the arch to create a destination and sense of place. As stated earlier, these infrastructure improvements are not enabled in the current specific plan. Here we see the relatively recent sidewalk improvements that were completed in conjunction with new development at Libet and Ventura. The west side is developing faster than the east by a large margin, with 80% of all development that has happened in the plan area since the adoption of the plan. In fact, over the past decade, 3/4 of all new multifamily along the corridor has developed in Woodland Hills, while Tarzana added most of the new office space, primarily medical. Most of Ventura is 71 to 80 feet wide along this segment, and at its widest is more than 90 feet wide near the 101 freeway in Woodland Hills. As you saw earlier in our presentation, the Vision Zero map identifies most of the segment of Ventura in the high injury network, including a cluster of fatal traffic collisions in Woodland Hills between Fallbrook and Canoga, and another between Winnetka and Corbin. Now we move on to the parking inventory. On-street parking is the most visible and publicly accessible, but it is limited by the space on the curb. With a clear picture of the parking supply and demand along the corridor, we can identify parking management strategies that will benefit visitors and businesses alike, while also reducing greenhouse gas emissions and congestion caused by searching for parking. For the western segment, we have 1,700 spaces on the curb, 85% of which are already metered. For each area, the consultant mapped occupancy rates using standard methodology approved by LADOT staff. In all the following maps, you will only see occupancy rates using metered data provided by LADOT. To clarify, these numbers are pre-pandemic and reflect what we refer to as normal parking trends. The specific plan as it is written today does not explicitly allow spending PIA funds for improving on-street parking, only off-street parking lots and structures. In order to allow on-street parking expenditures, the current plan requires a relatively intense and difficult process. As a reminder, in the interest of time, we will only focus on the pedestrian-oriented areas for our presentation today. In all maps, the POA is indicated with a darker gray. The map you see before you is the Woodland Hills POA located south of the 101 freeway and bound by Topanga Canyon to the west and Canoga to the east. On all parking maps, we want to emphasize that block faces showing in purple or black experience the highest measured occupancy for at least 1 hour a day. Most of the block faces in this POA are shown with green lines because they are below 70% occupancy. The only block face shown in purple is between Baza and De Roja on the southern side of Ventura. The Tarzana POA is located between Burbank and Reseda. Here, the highest occupancy rates are clustered between Burbank and Amigo, with most of the purple along the southeast corner block at Burbank and Ventura. The orange is more frequent here and indicates the mid-range occupancy of 70 to 85%. The Encino POA is located between Balboa and Noeline. Here, the highest occupancy rates are clustered between Rubio and Noeline, with some higher occupancy rates at Lameda. And notably, the blocks between Lameda and Rubio are at the lowest occupancy rate. Now we move on to the conditions of the sidewalk, the most vital infrastructure for a pleasant and safe pedestrian environment. Our consultant provided a sidewalk report that inventoried sidewalk widths and categorized them as suboptimal and missing. Suboptimal meaning sidewalks that are less than 9 feet wide, because 9 feet is considered the standard minimum width to accommodate all the competing uses of the sidewalk. Missing sidewalks includes both completely missing or simply unpaved. Additionally, observations indicated where there are missing curb ramps at crosswalks, provided a tree count distinguishing between shade and non-shade trees, and provided additional observations of other obstacles for pedestrians. This is all preliminary data that has not been finalized yet. Also, while we trust that our consultant has done a thorough inventory and provided reliable data, we value community observations that may help us identify any missing data that may not be captured in this draft. Once again, we will focus our overview today on the pedestrian subareas as we did with the parking, but additional data and observations were collected along the corridor segments in between as well. For the Woodland Hills POA, the consultant found 7 suboptimal sidewalks, no sidewalks were missing, and ramps were present at all crosswalks. The tree count indicates that most trees in this POA are shade trees, but on average, only 1 tree was found for every 100 feet of sidewalk. This map shows the location of the 7 suboptimal sidewalks in purple. Almost half of the very long northern block of Ventura in this POA is suboptimal. South of Ventura, the suboptimal sidewalks are found along the smaller cross streets. These are some of the on-the-ground observations that complement our data. The consultant found long stretches of driveways adjacent to one another that create unsafe conditions for pedestrians as they expose anyone walking along the sidewalk to potential conflict with a vehicle. They found landscape parkways along wide sidewalks, awnings with poles that add to the obstacles on the sidewalk, bus stops with insufficient space to serve both transit riders and pedestrians walking through, merchandising displays that encroach on the sidewalk, outdoor dining up to the property line, and in some cases beyond the property line and practically enclosed, and finally, curb ramps that were not yet updated to today's ADA standards. Now we move on east to the Tarzana POA, where the consultant found only 1 suboptimal sidewalk and no missing curb ramps. The tree conditions are similar here to Woodland Hills in that most are shade trees, but they are not very frequent as you walk along. For Tarzana, the only suboptimal sidewalk is found at Mecca Avenue. There is another small segment shown here to the east, but it is just beyond the POA's boundary. In Tarzana, the consultant found cases where planters were placed at the frontage and beyond the property line. Outdoor dining appears here again, but notably there is a distinction between small temporary furniture adjacent to the frontage and enclosed dining beyond the property line that further reduces the walkable area that is already too narrow. On a positive note, we see an example of a bus stop at Burbank with a shelter that still allows enough space for pedestrians to pass. For the Encino POA, the consultant found 4 suboptimal sidewalks and 1 missing sidewalk. No ramps were observed missing where they should exist, and among trees observed, tree frequency begins to increase here to 1.6 per 100 feet of sidewalk. The shade tree proportion decreases to 65%. The map on your screen shows the suboptimal sidewalks are found on both the north and south sides of Ventura near Balboa. All other suboptimal sidewalks are found south of Ventura at smaller cross streets, and Noeline Avenue is the only street with a missing sidewalk. On this slide, the bottom left is the missing sidewalk at Noeline. The observations also highlight that in some cases, trees are missing tree wall covers, which reduces the paved path for pedestrians. And in other cases, where there are trees and ample space, the trees themselves do not provide shade. Ideally, you would have a shade tree with a tree cover in place while still allowing enough space for pedestrians. On a positive note, the consultant found and observed areas with awnings and planters that could be present while still allowing enough space for pedestrians and newly updated ramps like the one on the bottom right. Now we move on to the eastern segment. In this case, we start at the 405 and we continue to the end of the corridor in Cahuenga Pass just beyond Barham Boulevard. For this segment, the consultant divided the corridor into 5 sub-areas. 3 of these sub-areas were originally designated as pedestrian sub-areas by the adopted specific plan. In the interest of time, we will focus on just these areas in green and red, and we will begin with a virtual tour again, and we'll view images that are indicated with the stars here again on the map. Here we're just east of the 405 freeway with a view of the Sherman Oaks Galleria, where the street is no wider than 80 feet, but still accommodates 8 lanes of traffic. This slide shows the village of Sherman Oaks, where a prominent landscape median with signage creates a sense of place. The right-of-way also narrows down to less than 70 feet wide here. This image is on Ventura and Fulton, where Casa Vega is located. The right-of-way continues to be less than 70 feet, and you can see that there are now fewer lanes of traffic with parking on either side. Plenty of trees are visible, but most are palms or non-shade trees. This is a segment where Ventura curves at Fairway near Pins Bowling. The intersection at Laurel Canyon has high visibility crosswalks, and you can see a few shade trees, but heavily interspersed with palm trees. This is a shopping center near Barham and Cahuenga Pass, where buildings in the street are vehicle-oriented, even when the right-of-way is relatively narrow. For the eastern segment, only 20% of all new development has occurred in this area since the adoption of the plan. The right-of-way narrows significantly for vehicle traffic, which means cars generally do not have as much space to speed as they do in the western segment. Most of Ventura Boulevard between the 405 freeway and Carpenter Avenue in Studio City is identified in the high injury network, including many segments within the pedestrian sub-areas. For the eastern segment, there are almost 1,900 spaces on the curb, roughly 90% of which are metered. We will review the occupancy data up next as we did with the western segment, highlighting the pedestrian sub-areas. Here are the pedestrian sub-areas which only exist in Sherman Oaks and Studio City per the original plan. Starting with the Sherman Oaks POA, most of the higher occupancy exists between Columbus and Kester, and then Willis and Beverly to the east. East of Tyrone Avenue is the Sherman Oaks Pedestrian Development District. In this case, most block faces east of Colbeth Avenue all the way to Fulton Avenue have higher occupancy, while the demand west of Colbeth is generally lower. In Studio City, most block faces demonstrate higher occupancy rates, which are especially acute between Whitsett and Laurel Grove. Now we move on to the sidewalk conditions for this western segment, for the eastern segment. In Sherman Oaks, 4 suboptimal sidewalks and 6 missing curb ramps were found. There are 1.8 trees per 100 feet, but only 55% are shade trees. The 3 suboptimal sidewalks are clustered near the Sepulveda intersection. The missing sidewalk is near Tyrone Avenue, and the yellow triangles indicate the 6 locations where curb ramps are missing. For the Sherman Oaks POA, observations include long stretches of driveways adjacent to one another, landscaping encroachments, bus stops with insufficient sidewalk space, sandwich signs, utility boxes, and outdoor dining with planters that further reduce the already narrow sidewalks. And finally, missing curb ramps at mid-block crosswalks. Now we move on to the adjacent Sherman Oaks Pedestrian Development District, where the consultant found 4 suboptimal sidewalks, 3 missing sidewalks, and 1 missing curb ramp. The trees slightly increased the frequency of 2 per 100 feet and to 65% shade trees. The missing sidewalk segments are near Tyrone, and most suboptimal sidewalks are near Woodman. The missing curb ramp is at Allitt Avenue. This area's observable conditions are not all that different from the previous area. One observation to note, as shown in the bottom left, are the frontage planters and missing tree wells that sometimes reduce the walkable path for pedestrians on the sidewalk. The Studio City POA has 6 suboptimal sidewalks and no missing sidewalks nor curb ramps. Among all the POAs, Studio City has the highest frequency of trees at 2.2 per 100 feet of sidewalk, but more than half of them do not provide shade. This is the lowest percentage among all the pedestrian areas. To compare, the highest tree frequency in the western segment was 1.6 trees per 100 feet, and the lowest shade tree percentage was 65%. Therefore, we find that while tree count may increase as we move east, the shade provided by those trees diminishes. The 6 suboptimal sidewalks are shown here. And as you can see, the longest segments are along Laurel Canyon Boulevard. The missing sidewalk near Whitsett Avenue that peeks into the map is just beyond the boundaries of this POA. The Studio City POA has some of the same issues as the prior POAs, but I will highlight particularly poor or unique observations from this area. First, on the top left, there is a bus stop between 2 driveways with 2 adjacent trash cans, no shade and no shelter. A person is standing there and demonstrates the environment for a pedestrian or anyone waiting for that bus. Up next, the image shows frontage parking directly adjacent to the sidewalk and the transit stop, with no buffer between pedestrians and vehicles. Third, the bus bay is typically used to pull over for passenger boarding and alighting. In some cases, however, it may cause a reduction in sidewalk width that competes with an optimal pedestrian environment. Fourth, once again, sidewalk widths are sometimes very narrow and cannot accommodate both a bus stop and sufficient space for pedestrians. As we analyze these observations, we want to recognize there are many sidewalks where there simply is not enough space for all amenities to be present, and priorities will likely be different by segment and community. We are presenting observations and data as it becomes available, but we will need your input to identify priorities for improvements as we move forward. Now we'll move over to the scope and legal requirements of our work program to clarify what is legally permissible for our work program today. This fee update must comply with some state legal requirements. In particular, the Mitigation Fee Act is a California law that regulates how local agency, such as City of LA, can establish, increase, or impose various fees. The Act also outlines requirements for what fees can be set, how many monies can be spent on what types of expenditures, as well as the process to approve fees. The California Environmental Quality Act applies whenever there is a discretionary land use action. When the specific plan was originally adopted, it required a full environmental impact report or EIR. For this project, we have hired a consultant to analyze that original EIR and help us determine the appropriate level of clearance to comply with CEQA. But to be clear, our work program is not scoped to complete a new EIR. Thus far, we've shared the policy framework, legal limitations of the Mitigation Fee Act, and newly available data, so that we can now have an initial discussion about what we want to fund and accomplish with collected fees. What you see before you are sample categories gathered from similar work programs in other areas of the city. We're providing them here because these items demonstrate what a fee could possibly fund. As stated earlier, we are moving away from the congestion-focused level of service, or LOS, to vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, which is centered on providing options to reduce the collective distances traveled by car. This is intended to be a jumping off point for further discussion as we work through the process and is not meant to be an exhaustive list in any way. As we refine, we welcome ideas that are not included here, acknowledging that the Ventura-Cahuenga corridor has unique issues and opportunities. Again, your participation is key as we prioritize and create a customized list of fee expenditures for Cahuenga and Ventura. And now I welcome Courtney Schoenwald for the remainder of this presentation.
Thank you, Delia, and thank you all for joining us today. You've been watching a recording for the web that's a repeat presentation of the content that was presented in public meetings held in late October and early November of 2021. In the public meetings we held, this portion of our event is where we listened to the public comments and answered live questions. However, for anyone watching this recording, while you couldn't engage in the interactive participation we had or provide live feedback at the listening Q&A session, you still have a way to provide us feedback. If you have further questions, you can always contact us. We have a shared email address that once sent comes to the whole team, but we also have a contact page on our new website that allows for you to enter a comment anytime and anywhere. There will be updates in the future, so if you're not on our interested parties list, we invite you to visit our website to sign up so that you can receive updates. As we stated before, our next steps will be refinement and prioritization. We aren't sure what kind of outreach will be involved, if any, with the next step, but we can say that we'd like to send out a survey in the future. We'll also need to do the nexus study for the fees that's required by the Fee Mitigation Act. And after that, then we can come up with recommendations that would be proposed for the adoption. Again, if you're not on our interested parties list, we invite you to visit our website to sign up so that you can receive updates as the project moves forward. And with that, thank you for joining us today. Goodbye.